Welcome to the Talking HealthTech podcast. My name is Peter Birch. Today, I'm excited to dive into episode 4 of this mini-series we've been doing with Smile Digital Health and Telstra Health around connected care and interoperability. In this episode, I'm joined by Marvin Malcolm from Telstra Health, Duncan Weatherston from Smile Digital Health, and Keith Kranz from SA Pathology. Gents, how are we going today?
Good, thanks.
Doing well, thank you.
Always excited to take this deep dive into connected care and what it means, and pulling people from different parts of Australia, around the world, and the ecosystem. So excited to be having this conversation today. And if anyone knows me, I like to really understand topics by seeing it in action. And so in this episode, I'm keen to learn a little bit more about the challenges around data and interoperability, particularly for SA Pathology, and the options available, what things look like before and what they might look like today, and perhaps into the future too. But for someone checking out this episode, they can also jump into the show notes of this one so they can see previous episodes in this mini-series, because this one will certainly make sense in isolation if this is the first one that you're diving into. But there's a lot more context in previous episodes we've done. They're linked up in the notes for this one to dive back in to learn a little bit more about the partnership between Smile Digital Health and Telstra Health. But Marvin, Duncan, I'm keen firstly to hear from you to help us frame this conversation a little bit more. We're not short of conversations around the importance of interoperability in the digital health space, that's for sure. But to get your take, given that we've got Marvin here locally in Australia, and I know Smile Digital Health global presence, but Duncan's got that international view too. Firstly, to help us frame this conversation, perhaps if I start with you, Marvin, like in your experience and looking at the Australian landscape, what's the critical factor here that we're focusing on around the importance of interoperability in the Australian healthcare ecosystem?
I think we're recording this on the day after the Spark Symposium.
Yes.
And I tell you what, it was really, when you think about what you need to do to drive interoperability, it really needs a community. No organization can do that in isolation. No organization is an island that drives interoperability. So everybody has to come together. And the enthusiasm, the willingness to participate, the willingness to be involved in making sure that we are connected was just, you could almost cut it with a knife, so to speak, yesterday. It was really good. And I think that's one of the really important things, is that you need the community to come together to say, you know what, we will make this happen, because we've talked about it for years. But when you actually say, okay, well, we've talked about it, now let's do it, that's when things start to happen. That's when magic starts to happen. And I think we've seen over the past 18 months that Spark has been going, and I'm kind of putting my Spark co-chair hat on for that. It has just blown open. We first started with a number of participants and OG organizations starting that, but it's blown to hundreds now who are involved. And to me, that's the thing that really gives interoperability its drive, and that's the thing that we needed, I think, in Australia in order to make that happen. So you need that vehicle to kind of drive it, and Spark does that. And the other thing I think that we need, which I think Spark also helps, is that you need sometimes those government and those legislative changes to happen in order to really make it happen. So now we've had the Healthcare Identifiers Act for a while, but that roadmap, the interoperability roadmap, the agency put together, which runs through for the next 5 years, and doing things like, even simple things like, how do we discover practitioners or organizations so that we can actually send messages to them? Little things like that you need, just underpinning the thing to make it a reality. I think for us, that's a thing that you need. You need everybody collaborating together in order to make it happen.
Yeah, those little hinges that move big doors, right? That's what we need. And look, Duncan, I know you're familiar with Spark. Obviously, I think I saw you at the Adelaide meetup that occurred too. But this point around bringing together stakeholders in the ecosystem and community to rally around interoperability, is it relevant in global markets and other parts of the ecosystem too, do you find?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in general, in order to have interoperability, you need a number of stakeholders because interoperability is dependent on the participation of different systems, right? I mean, the whole idea of interoperability is bringing together the value prop of, a clinician in one location and the effort of a clinician in another location, and then being able to share that information in a meaningful way to deliver meaningful outcomes. And I think if you look at the global landscape, what you'll see is that this is true in Europe, North America, Asia, Australia. It's a ubiquitous kind of need. The key thing, though, that's important about interoperability in healthcare is the character of interoperability. When we think about interoperability in other industries, like banking, the character of interoperability there is driven by many years of normal behavior around the information being exchanged. The idea of ledgers is thousands of years old, or at least 1,000 years old. It's got a long history. It's one of those fun things. If you ever look up the history of accounting, it's quite remarkable. It goes all the way back to the Romans. The thing is, healthcare is a different beast. Healthcare has a semantic problem. It has a structural problem. It has a legislative problem. There's so much that goes into what makes healthcare unique in each of the instances. The ability to drive interoperability requires that you overcome each of those hurdles, right? If you take a look at laboratories, the way that a laboratory is identified is different. Then the mechanism that you record for a particular lab is different. The way you deal with concentrations is different. Sometimes it's molality. It's all, it's got other types of concentration units as well. And then beyond just what the name of the lab is and how you record it, there are things like reference ranges that talk about the instrumentation that does the lab work. And so when you think about the character of interoperability for a lab ecosystem, it suddenly becomes a layered problem. And it's not just about the willingness of a community to participate. It becomes a very detailed technical problem, which is engaged in the character of implementation, the science of it, if you will, right? So I think the thing that we see when we try and accomplish interoperability globally is this dependency on more than just willingness. It is a dependency on collaboration at the standards level. It's a dependency on collaboration at the terminology level. It's a dependency on collaboration in clinical engagement. There's just so much that goes into it that every participant, and Australia being no different than the others, brings something unique and interesting to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great. We've got Keith here to give that context and what's happening on the real world, so to speak, and the reality side of things. For those unfamiliar with SA Pathology and the work you do in South Australia, tell us a little bit more about that, and perhaps leading into some of the challenges that might relate to this conversation.
Okay. SA Pathology is quite a unique organisation because we provide services to both the public and private sector. So in a sense, we're servicing a population of about 1.8 million people, and that basically spreads from metropolitan to regional to remote. And each of those represents their own challenges in terms of how to deliver pathology services in a timely manner. Now, the other thing that's important is that pathology is one of the two primary, outside of clinical observation, pathology is one of the two primary diagnostic tools. So, and it drives basically not only the diagnosis, but the treatment for the patient and how successful that treatment is as part of that process. And so I would suggest that the next layer is data, because at the end of the day, what we do is we need data, but we need good quality data. Mm. And in many respects, particularly in Australia, whilst we live in a community, we almost live in a tribal community, as I would put it, because we've got GPs who are a tribe, we've got the acute system who's another one, we have obviously the bureaucracy as part of that, we have researchers. So that community, in many respects, are all kind of out there doing different things. And so as a pathology provider, we kind of sit in that mix, and we're really trying, I guess, as much as possible to be able to obviously link data across those multiple organisations, and trying to talk into those different organisations without standards is a challenge. And that's why standardisation is important to our business as such.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. But, Marvin, those challenges that Keith articulated. They sound like business challenges that wouldn't be just the isolated to SA pathology. Obviously, is this something we're seeing across Australia?
Yeah, I think so. And I think everyone is, because technology moves at a really fast pace. And outside of healthcare, you see that people are expecting certain things from you as a technology organization. Even though we're in healthcare, they think, well, you've got computers, haven't you? Surely you should be able to do this, or surely you should be able to do that. And that whole drive that we're just seeing, that's external, which is kind of implicit in many ways, about how we need to treat consumers, how do we need to develop systems that can do true interoperability. I think it's something that is pushing us a certain way. And from Keith's perspective, he's got that in the pathology space, but those same drivers across other parts of the healthcare. I mean, Telstra Health, we have the same drivers in primary care and in aged care and in population health. So it's important for us to, I guess, to start to understand that those drivers, those technology do apply across the board in healthcare. They're, special things for different verticals potentially, but I think that the reality is that they're all still there.
And no doubt, I'm going to hazard a guess, Duncan, that these are challenges not just in Australia but globally as well, or particularly what about the US?
Yeah, those challenges are pretty global. I mean, the issue in technology is driven primarily by implementation, right? Like, if you think about the character of health technology, the use cases are specific to a particular clinical engagement or an administrative engagement or whatever it happens to be. And then they're different in each of the locations where you have these types of interactions. For example, if you think about the use of an EMR, an electronic medical record, in a hospital, their objective is managing patients in rooms, essentially, right? There's admissions, discharge, and in addition to that, supplementally, there's a clinical record, which is a system of record that tracks a set of facts about the patient's journey through the hospital. And so the experience of information in that space is driven by the need of a clinician or an administrator or a nurse operating in a hospital environment against a particular care pathway for a patient who's in that setting. If you then take that same clinician and move them to a primary care setting, their needs are different again, because they're not managing a journey through a set of inpatient encounters. They're managing a set of episodic encounters, and each one of them is an isolated event driven by, somebody shows up and has a conversation and then leaves, and they're trying to track over a set of discrete encounters, care pathway. And then if you look at that same patient and that same provider who maybe are operating a long-term care center, you have yet another model in which the clinician and patient interact. And so every time they record that information, they're recording a different set of characteristics. They may be interested in a different set of measures. They may be interested in a different trajectory. And then we try and bring that together. What you're trying to do is merge essentially 3 or 4 different use cases into a similar story across a disparate set of technologies that are built with different outcomes in mind. And that's universal. That's not bound to any one location.
No, sounds like it. And back to Keith, I'm keen to understand the challenge a little bit more, and perhaps the tech stack or the just the hurdles that SA pathology face that you kind of started to tell us about a little bit more, or at least when you set that scene. Particularly then, why like a FHIR platform would be the ideal solution to address some of those issues. Walk me through that.
Okay. I think one of the challenges we have today is healthcare has been application focused. It's all been about the application. And what we've done, we put in lots of applications. And to be quite honest, all that's done is create islands of information in my mind. And we have to step out of that area, because a lot of people are in their comfort zone when it's an application, because when it's delivered via vendor, people know what they're sort of dealing with as part of that process. The trouble is then you're stuck in the vendor model, where at the end of the day, the vendor has you in control rather than the other way around. I'm not in control of anything because invariably vendors will lock the data up in their proprietary systems. I can't get access to that and those kind of things. And we have to change that. We've got to be able to move to a data-driven model and ultimately a fabric as such. And I think that's where I'm certainly trying to get to, is to enable that data to be able to move across the system. And one of the other problems is because a lot of those applications are legacy applications, as I would call them, at the end of the day, because they're legacy, those legacy systems, you could enter whatever you liked into those systems. There's not a lot of checks and balances on the data that's going into those systems. So there's a lot of quality issues. And so one of the challenges that I have as I'm moving into this FHIR world, which is to me is all about standards, at the end of the day, is how do I fix some of the inherent issues that I've got currently in the system, because I'm having to talk to those legacy systems and I'm having to bring data across into that FHIR world. And in that process, I want to improve the quality. Because if we are going to use things like AI and so forth in the future, you've got to do it off the back of good quality data. And that's an inherent issue that we've got within the system. One of the reasons why we ended up with FHIR I've been in healthcare a long time, and one of the things that back in the 90s that I was involved in was the building of a CDR all the way back in the 90s. And like at that time, we didn't even have HL7 standards, and we had to build a couple of standards because we had to build one for pathology because this was outside of pathology, and we had to build one for radiology as well. And in many respects, through that project, I had a bit of an epiphany in that project and realised, we could really make this much more personalised than it was, because really at the end of the day, then the CDR was still just another application. It just meant to say it was on a larger database. But the thing that kind of attracted me into the FHIR space was the concept of being able to compartmentalise data, and also it was secure by design. And those two things are important because people will use security, rightly or wrongly, around why we shouldn't be doing things because it's not secure. And that's a particular issue when you're trying to talk to the private sector. Because we're a government organisation, it's very difficult in government to actually talk outside of the organisation, particularly when it's patient data, because we're the custodians of this patient data and our job is not to give it to anybody else. And at the end of the day, to me, that's a fundamental thing because interoperability is about sharing data. And that data needs to mean the same things across the system if it's going to be useful, because if it doesn't mean the same, then at the end of the day, people are going to interpret it, or it'll be interpreted incorrectly by other things that we'll use on the top of that to help us interpret the data.
Yeah. 100% on the same page with you there, Keith, in terms of, some of those reasons we choose not to do things in healthcare and the utilizing some of those tools there. I get stuck on this point though a bit though, Keith. I'm keen to unpack it a bit more with you. Is that, to your point, there's a lot of data in the system, in legacy systems that exists that we need to be able to access on call. And wouldn't it be lovely if we could kind of just, from tomorrow, all the data is super clean because we're putting it in a new thing, but we can't do that, obviously. So what's that bridge, that connection? How seamless is, what does that look like to be able to, as you say, not just utilize that existing data that you have that's been captured maybe since the 90s, but right up through to now, but then also to that point of making sure it's good quality so we can do even cooler things with it, let alone just access it in the first place. Yeah.
Interesting enough, that data we have been collecting since the 90s is structured pathology data and at the atomic level. And so if you want to be able to do something, then you've got to be able to, that data has to be in an atomic form. And once again, that's one of the exciting things about My Health Record, because My Health Record is stuck in a PDF world today with CDA format, and the reality is that data is not realisable like that. So it needs to be turned into something else, and they've started on that journey. One of the significant tools from my perspective, because I've got to be able to talk to government systems as well as to, in the future, to private systems as well, is obviously the integration piece, because the integration piece, being able to bring the data across, is important to that, is actually quite important to that process. We, in South Australia, we sit underneath a department. So the challenge that I face is the department has the integration piece, because in many respects, it's really integrating a whole lot of systems that sit within the government space. And so for me, I've been somewhat reliant on somebody else to do that work. And that actually has been a bit of a challenge as well, because the SA Health has been stuck in the HL7 world. And so, in fact, I've had to bring them into the FHIR world, and they're really only at the beginning of that journey. And fortunately, the people working at the integration level understood what the value of FHIR was. That, in fact, for me, HL7 is the equivalent of posting letters, in my view. Whereas we need to move to a world where, we can exchange data quickly and seamlessly. And that's, to me, what FHIR brings to the table, which is not what we've had before, because we can't rely on the postman anymore. Healthcare needs to move we got to build the systems for the next 30 years. And I'd argue in this country, healthcare is broken. And unless we fundamentally change some of the underlying technologies, then we're going to continue to live with a broken system, and we need to change that, and technology will help us get there.
I feel like you and I could chat for a lot longer, Keith. I might just ignore Marvin and Duncan for a sec, because I wanted to follow on from that, because then I'm going to go to Marvin in a minute just for more context. However, to that point of, I love the quote of, can't rely on the postman anymore. I'm down with that, the post person. Then looking at, but I guess and talking about the healthcare system might be broken, but I guess, I always go back to this point of like, well, for what purpose? Like, what would this look like if we do it well? Because just because we have super tidy data that connects nicely with each other, that might be really handy and clean from a data structure point of view. But if it doesn't mean something to either, that might reduce some costs, I guess, and be efficient in the health system. But I feel like, more importantly, is there an opportunity for this better data and the exchange to ultimately improve better patient outcomes? Like does it improve diagnostic accuracy and all that? Is there a connection between getting the data right and improving the outcomes for patients?
Oh, most definitely there is, because look, traditionally pathology has been about clinicians. That's the first thing. It's also been about, I get an order or a request form. So most people will be aware the request form starts the pathology journey at the end of the day. That's the order that you generate for tests. And then I provide results. And traditionally that's been the pathology model, which is kind of like a very short journey. And the future for pathology is, how do you then value add to that process and do a lot more with that data? Because if you actually atomicize that data, then you have the potential to do a whole lot of things we never did before, particularly as a diagnostic provider, because all of a sudden, you can start to link some things together that we weren't able to do before. And so from our perspective, this is a transformational change for our business. I'm driving a transformation strategy in this business. And in fact, the good thing for me, the executive have bought into that process, because they're the bankers in this process, because there's a cost involved in doing that. But we do need to transform the way we go about our business. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that means the patient comes into focus. When that CDR was built, that was all supposedly about patient-centered care. But to be quite honest, I don't believe we've delivered patient-centred care in the last 25 years or so. We talk about it, but I don't think we've truly delivered that. But things have changed. People have got smartphones now, which is actually a portable device. They never had those things before. So those things are things that we can leverage as part of that bringing the patient into the conversation, which we've not been good at doing before. And I think when you bring the conversation into the patient of that conversation, you're also shifting the power to the patient as well, because the patient has a responsibility in their own healthcare. And by providing people with information and the right information enables them to take some responsibility. Now, the other thing is that not everybody's capable of being responsible for their own healthcare, but if we can make a section of the population responsible, and by giving them data, then we got more time to spend on those people that we need to help, because the system is also, at the end of the day, is about helping people as well. And in that process, there is benefit, because a simple example of this, we're doing an e-requesting project, which is about bringing orders electronic across from the GP to ourselves. Now, today, how stupid is this? The GP's got an electronic system, then they produce a piece of paper, they hand it to the patient, and then that patient brings it to me, and then I've got to key that information back into the system. So there's a time saving for me in that process, certainly from a business perspective. And so in many respects, it won't change the GP workflow much, but it will change my workflow a great deal, because today I can't manage the pipeline. I don't know how many people are going to turn up at the front door of a collection centre, because we have a model that allows people to walk in and also make appointments as well. But generally those appointments are for specific tests, things like a glucose tolerance test, for example. You have to make an appointment for that, because the reality is you have to drink something, and then we have to take measures across multiple hours as part of that. So there are certain things that are appointment based, but most of the time it's walk in. So more often than not, what happens is you open up the collection centre doors maybe at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and for all you know, there could be 20 people standing there. And if I add 3 or 4 minutes to each of those patients, because I've got to enter some data into a computer system, that ain't good value, because most people don't want to wait. I certainly don't want to wait. In fact, if it was me, I'd walk out of there and go somewhere else. And this is, to me, also about that customer experience and how we improve the customer experience. And then the byproduct of all this, if we've got data, then that data then can also be used as part of, things like prediction and prevention and so forth, which is not something we've been strong in the past.
Yeah, I love that, Keith. Thank you for walking us through that, because, I think there's so much value in understanding a particular workflow or specific operation. You think, oh, well, if we just change this one thing, like what kind of impact will it have? But as you clearly articulated then, that has implications right up through to population health level. So I think by getting these small hinges done correctly, we can really make an impact. And there's definitely something in that point. You raised it a couple of times of, we're very good in, and if I was to frame a different way, I feel like we're very good in healthcare at replicating old ways of doing things, but putting it into a digital form. Yep. And I guess that's a good start. But then, there's really opportunity for us to rethink how we do things, given that patients are very capable with smart devices, the power of infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't just need to replicate the physical workflow with digital bits of paper. Marvin, I imagine, given that the breadth of Telstra Health across Australia and the expertise and the involvement you have across the healthcare system, this would be a familiar story, no doubt, and that there's a role that the Telstra Health technology plays in kind of enabling some of these benefits.
Yeah, I like what Keith just mentioned, and if I think about myself as a consumer, when you've got that data, that rich amount of data, to deliver a a table of numbers on a piece of paper to somebody as a consumer, I'm looking at thinking, okay, that's nice. We did some work a couple of years ago around interpretive comments. I think it would be nice if the output from that you may send back that same thing to a GP, but the output to me as a consumer is a more of a narrative or something that says, by the way, your cholesterol is a little bit high right now. It's been trending up for the past 3 years. You probably ought to take some action around that. Those sort of things. So if you're going regularly to the same pathology provider, which if they're treating you well, you likely will do, then that sort of narrative and that history around the results that you get, for me as a consumer, I think is actually something that's quite good. When my son recently got his pathology results back, and he's looking at this is the first time he's ever looked at it. It's the first time he's ever had it to look at. He's looking at it and thinking, well, what on earth is all of this? It didn't mean anything to him. So, fortunately for myself, I've kind of worked a little bit in this space. So I was able to say, here's how you read it. Here's how you interpret what's on that piece of paper or those sheets of paper. And I think we're now getting to the point where we can start to do something, that's patient centric. How do we give the results back to the patient in a way that they can consume, as opposed to, how do we just churn out the data as we've always done in the past? So I think those sorts of things allow us to start to think about the patient more broadly, and in all of healthcare, I think that's a sort of model that we need to start thinking about.
To me, it's about turning individuals into citizen scientists. The reality is, how do we, if we engage with that patient, how do we make them part of that process, and how do we turn them into a researcher? And I have seen this particularly in areas like renal disease. You'll find that people who've got chronic disease will very closely manage their healthcare, because there's the difference sometimes between dialysis and end of life a renal disease. And so and those people will very closely manage things because it's in their interest to do so, because they're battling with a disease, but what you're trying to do is to keep them at a level of wellness that enables them to go about their activities of daily living, if you like. And so that's the value in giving the data back to the patient. And then, of course, how you then bring that up to that population health level, because yes, I am a bit of a population health convert as well, because when you start to look at those cohorts of people, there's things we can learn from that process on how we might do things. So, for example, if we were using our diagnostic data and looking at those patients that do have impaired kidney function, can we impact when they might travel into dialysis, which in many respects for people is quite life-changing, because that means you're tied to a chair a couple of days a week to do dialysis. And then on top of that, the cost of dialysis is about $100,000 in Australia per annum. So there's some of the benefits that come out of data, and it all starts with that with some of that diagnostic data and how we might blend that together. And to me, that's the future of healthcare, and that's all built on the basis of standards and so forth.
Yeah. And hey, Duncan, I know, there's a lot of work that Smile Digital Health does in this space, generally pulling information together. But I'd love to hear are there lessons or reflections or from your experience as well in other parts of the world that can be applied to the work that's being done in SA pathology here?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the lab ecosystem is a common thread throughout healthcare globally. So, no part of the laboratory workflow is unique to any, jurisdiction. I mean, there are individual workflows around distribution, what have you, and ordering and the like. But in general, the clinical aspects of labs are consistent. You should be able, in fact, the whole idea of interoperability is I should be able to take a lab from one source and bring it to a clinician in another environment and have them be able to get value mean from it, right? And examples in in real terms of what we're doing around that are things like the International Patient Summary, which allow us to gather information from one location and bring it to another location and get value from it. So everything that we're doing in Australia is both valuable and applicable internationally, and the reverse is true as well. The work going on internationally is going to be valuable in Australia. The main thing, an area we haven't really touched on, so Keith kind of touched on it, but the reason why we need to have standards that are semantically interoperable is not because a clinician needs to be able to read something and make sense of it. Because a clinician can read a lab, and if the concentration is different from one moment to the next, still get the same value out of it. They understand the character of concentration. What we need to be able to do is compute on the back of information, right? We need to be able to do a lot of the work on behalf of the clinician. We need to reduce the cognitive load. We need to make sure that they're able to get the intent of the information without having to make them do all of the mathematics, if you will. An example in an easy case is a clinician will often care about how much a person's weight has changed while they are in their care, right? So if you're coming out of surgery and you're in a bed, one of the tells for your condition is input output, or this is also true for cardiology. There's a bunch of cases where we would care about this type of thing. If all you give them is a weight 1, weight 2, weight 3, weight 4, every time they look at it, they have to do the mental math. Did it go up or did it go down? Was it up and down before? They have to go across the list. Was it up, down? Was it up, down? Was it up, down? How's it trending? And what does it do? If you calculate that for them and then show them the trend, you take that load off them, and they get the value out of it. They can see the person's weight's going up, it's going down, it's staying consistent, but they didn't have to do any work from it at a glance. If you think about pathology and just think about labs in general, trending a lab is a critical capability. What's going on with this person's pathology? What's going on with their health system, right? Are there you brought up an example, right? Or actually, I think Keith, you brought up an example, which is, are your cholesterol readings going up or down? How is cholesterol being viewed, right? You want to see a graph of that, and you want to make it work. And if you're not making the data computable, then somebody has to do that computation in their head. They have to look at one value and then evaluate the next value to see if the character of that information is the same as the previous one. Can they do a comparison literally? Do they have to do a transformation first and then do it? The example I was trying to give earlier on, for example, imagine if you had some lab that measured molality and then concentration in terms of specific mass, and then you try and do a comparison, right? You now have to do we all did this in chemistry at one point in our lives or other, where we do these kinds of concentration conversions, but who wants to do that while we're trying to figure out the care of a patient, right? That work should be done for you. That's automation, and it goes beyond that. You should be able to calculate the predictability of outcomes. There's a model in the US called the Seattle Heart Score. I think it's something very similar to that. And what it tells you is the probability that your patient is going to be readmitted to hospital, or that they're going to have a major event in the near future. And it's based on a set of trends associated with their input, output, their flows, there's a bunch of measures that you take to determine this probability. Of course, you can calculate it, but are you going to while you're doing your rounding? Are you going to realize what's the consequence of my making this decision right now to that output, their likelihood to come back to hospital? You're not going to. It's too hard to do. And if you do, it's because you have way too much time on your hands in a hospital. Nobody's got that kind of time on their hands. Computability is the win. Computability is how we're going to take the load off of clinicians, how we're going to help people adhere to best practices, how we're going to take the science and make it real, and then how we're going to take the reality and bring it back to science. This is absolutely the most important use case in interoperability, is the ability for us to use our tooling to deliver value to all of the constituents across the ecosystem in ways that are meaningful to them in their particular situation. Back to where we were before. What Keith said is really important. The application is what drives the clinical use case, right? Or the clinical use case is what drives the application. We've gone down this path where you attach data to that. We need to separate out the data, make sure we've got a great data model, a great structure, and then we need to bring it back to the clinician in a way that's usable by them and delivers all that value they're not getting today because they're not interoperable. Like that really is ultimately what we're trying to accomplish. And that's true in Australia, that's true in Canada, it's true in the US, it's true in Europe. This is a global need.
Yeah.
And I think an example of that is the porphyrin case that you're working on at the moment, Keith. Where you've got all this historical data, but what really makes it powerful is how you can map out that family tree and say, you know what, your parent or your grandparents had this, therefore there is a chance that you may also have this. And being able to visualize that to a clinician, that makes all the difference. They don't have to go and start searching for that information. So I think it's a great example.
Yeah. And for such a rare disease as that one, because it is a hereditary illness, is that it's actually quite hard to identify whether somebody has that, because there's a set of conditions that, if you like, are indicators. How do we use compute to help look at all those conditions and say, well, clinically you need to look at this area because that needs to be investigated, and potentially that might be. So in a way, it's a suggestion, because obviously the challenge I think we have clinically is we're not wanting to tell doctors what to do, but we want to use data to help them practice the art, because I'd argue there's the art and science in this process, and what we're wanting to do is to help people with the art by giving them information, and this is particularly the case in where radiology has been using images for quite a long time now, and this is a relatively new area for pathology, where in fact some areas of pathology are image-based, and digital pathology is an example, and usually that relates to things like cancer diagnosis. So what you're doing then is you're using the technology of the image to have the pathologist focus on the area where the cells don't look normal, and that speeds up the diagnostic process. It speeds up the turnaround time that we can provide the results back, so the treatment can start, or work can go ahead with the patient. So that's an area which is emerging for us, relatively new for pathology, because it's quite different from radiology, because radiology is about body parts in many respects, whereas pathology is about cells. And there's a lot of cells. And so that's the opportunity. And interestingly enough, DICOM, which is a standard used in radiology, DICOM and FHIR are coming together. And that's another important step forward to me in how even that piece of information, where it's an image, will then be a much more usable tool than merely having a JPEG or otherwise.
Gents, I've been reflecting on these comments because I picture my own experiences of accessing pathology results from a GP, and I have vivid memories of getting literally a rolled up, because it was when the fax was sent to the clinic, and it literally did that rolly thing, so it was even hard to open, let alone then the blurry. And you think, to your point, Keith, that we're obviously not trying to give better insights in data to tell clinicians what to do, but it feels like almost the role of the clinicians is to be, and GPs, whatever the clinician might be, is to take all the data and the information and tell that narrative and the support and everything for the patient, and take them through that process. And that's what patient care is, and that journey. And I feel like we've, for years just served up a blob of information and sort out what to do with this. And then it's we've got to give them half a chance, and then on the patient side, the old approach was always you'd get your pathology results in a sealed up envelope, or, your specialist report, don't open this. It's about you, but you can't read it because you won't understand it. And it needs to be explained to you by a doctor who will be able to explain it to you. Everyone's got the internet. Hey, so I feel like these days and adults that receive care have got the ability to, and yes, there are edge cases where there's sensitive information that needs to be provided and you want to be able to have that flexibility. But I feel like we've got to give the clinicians a chance. And so the work that we've been talking about is certainly in that direction, and it's exciting to have that passion from each of you to be able to envisage that and actually make that a reality. I know Duncan gave us a great vision of like where we're heading and where we should be going. But if we were to close out this conversation, and perhaps for each of you, any other final thoughts on that, maybe Marvin, if you were to start, and then for Duncan, and then Keith, lastly, I'd just like to hear where you're heading in terms of SA pathology. You've given us a glimpse, but just to close out. But Marvin, any other final thoughts on this one?
I think the whole area of standards is good. I think we kind of got a tick there. We know where we're heading. We've got the interoperability story kind of mapped out. I think that's good. Another tick. For us as Telstra Health, and one of the reasons we partnered with Smile is you do need the technology to be able to make that a reality. And we're fortunate in Australia, I'd say, is that we're of a size where it makes the problem interesting and good to work on. But we're not at a size in Australia, even at the national level, where it's an incredibly hard problem to solve in terms of scalability and so on. We're working with Smile to use that platform to allow us to do all of the things I think we need to be able to do here in Australia. It's a very scalable platform. I know some of the new work that they're doing around scaling data, which is really interesting. It's a piece that people kind of it's not sexy, but when you're starting to collect lots and lots of data, as we will need to do in the future, well, how do you ensure that the technology that you're using can support that? And those limitless Postgres databases that Azure and AWS are providing, Smile are on the ball, and they are working to certify on those platforms, so that as the data explodes, as a platform, we have the capability to support that. So then, people like Keith, who need to make use of that to do some interesting analytics and interesting work, are able to support that. So I think having the right technology under the covers also helps that. I know Keith is doing some work with AI at the moment. Maybe he'll chat about that, to be able to take some of those old legacy reports that he's got stashed away in a room somewhere and bring those to life. Those are the sorts of things that we need to also be thinking about doing in order to make the future a lot brighter.
Love that, Marvin. What about you, Duncan?
So I think one of the things that we should all keep in mind is the objective that we're trying to accomplish, which is, at least in well-funded environments, what we're trying to do is maximize the health value for the population. And the way we can get there is by creating efficiencies in the delivery of care, because there is no shortage in the need for additional care. One of the facts that somebody presented to me the other day, and I didn't check the veracity myself, but it seems believable, is that 1 in 12 people have a rare disease. That the diseases themselves are rare, but the number of them makes them less rare. So when you think about what we're trying to accomplish, we're trying to drive efficiency into the healthcare system, reducing the critical dependency on the things that we can, so we free up opportunity to work on those things we need. And it's that flow, that pathway which allows us to drive efficiency, that automation enables, that companies like Telstra enable, that the efforts of SA Pathology enable, and that all the other participants in the health ecosystem are trying to do, right? Like, what we're trying to drive is the ability for clinicians and patients and all the other participants in the delivery of care to get to the answers faster that they can get to faster, so we can explore the additional problems that will continue to exist, right? Yeah, imagine we could cure all of the easy diseases. When I say easy, all of the common diseases, cancer, cardiology issues, renal issues. If we could solve all those problems today, we wouldn't have cured illness. We would have just cured classes of illness, and new classes of illness would step in to become the problem we're trying to address. There is no shortfall in the need for resources. We're not undermining anybody's opportunity for employment by delivering automation. What we're doing is we're moving people up the stack to drive the real needs that we have, which is the delivery of care to a broader population. Solve the low-hanging fruit or the solvable problems, and take the intractable problems and make them tractable. And it's that process that we're all on.
Well aligned with that one, Duncan. Well said. Yeah, Keith, would love to hear any final thoughts and things you're working on. Marvin hinted towards some work you're doing with AI as well. Help us round out this conversation.
Okay. Well, the first thing, I think we got to make things simple by design. I see constantly we put in place applications that requires people to make multiple clicks, who need extensive training to find things, yet dropping through multiple tabs to see things. That's a problem straight up, because we're not making it easy for people to do. And the thing is that you mentioned before about the reports. Just recently, of course, that we've dropped the rules around how soon patients can have access to their reports. Now they can get them before the GP gets them, except in a couple of circumstances. And those circumstances are appropriate, because in anatomical pathology, they do a lot of testing on cells, and particularly around cancer and so forth. If you're going to give somebody a report around that, then you do need some kind of clinical expertise in that. And the other area is genetics, which we really haven't touched on, but genetics is a whole new area of pathology at the end of the day, particularly now that we're doing whole genome sequencing, which is a whole change when we talk about data. So like our genetics people, they're collecting data at the rate of a petabyte of data annually, and growing. And so the challenges really from my perspective is we need to make the reports patient friendly, because they can't be just clinician friendly at the end of the day, which is what they have been. That's been a problem. That's a fundamental shift right there. The other thing we need to be able to do is on top of that is we got to make ordering easy for clinicians as well, particularly genetics tests, because genetics tests are quite complex in terms of their descriptions. And so one of the areas we're focused on is how we create what I call clinical guided ordering. And clinical guided ordering is using a bit of intelligence around the ordering pattern. So when a clinician needs to order up a genetics test, we're guiding through that process so they order the right tests. Because that's another area of saving for the system, is that people send us in requests, then all of a sudden we've got to have back and forth with the clinicians about have they ordered the right tests. So we can't even start the testing process until we hit on what's the right test. So again, that's another focus for us. Another area is, Marvin mentioned AI. I had somebody diligently in this organisation keeping paper records for patients with porphyria, I have to say, over 50 years. And what I've done is I've taken those paper records and I've digitised them using AI, which what that means, I've liberated that data from that piece of paper and I've turned it into digital, which means now I can actually use it for purposes that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. It would have been lost. So that to me is a real opportunity, and there'll be more of that. And they're simple things in my view. You know, at the end of the day, that's not around helping decision making. That's just liberating data and making it accessible. So that's another area of focus for us. And the other thing is how we bring that research back into that process. So my task from here is I got to improve the patient experience. And of course, at the end of the day, I got quite a challenging environment because I got the patient, the clinician, a researcher, and then there's a whole bunch of other people who want access to the data as well. So that's part of really, for me, is how I actually make that data accessible and only that information that's required for those people. The other thing is codification. There's a process around having to codify the data so it means the same thing in one place to another. And the two areas that drive pathology for me is SNOMED, because they want to use SNOMED for ordering and LOINC for results. So when somebody says to me, I need all the results for patients who've got the diagnostic data related to patients with colitis, I can go and pull that data out based on the LOINC codes that I've got for the report. So they're kind of areas of focus for me, and I can't do that on my own. I've got to go and engage with people in the business. I need the medical scientists, the pathologists to be involved in that process, some of the busiest people in our business. For the fire work, I've got to go and talk to the Duncans and the Telstras and so forth of the world, because I have to be able to do that as a community. So everything I do, whether it's codification, whether it's data, whether it's ordering, it's all about that community and how I engage with other people, how I bring them on this journey, because fire is a journey. And we're really only at the beginning of this journey in a lot of ways, and it's an evolving journey, because there will be gaps in the standards, and we have to make the best guess about that. And that's really, I think, the challenge that I've got, is how I bring people on this journey, with the end goal being how ultimately, at the end of the day, we can improve the delivery of patient care as part of that, and then use the data for the greater good, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Keith, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have a glimpse into, what that world looks like for you, and also the perspectives of Duncan and Marvin. All the details for Telstra Health and Smart Digital Health and SA Pathology will be in the show notes of this episode. People can check out. And as I mentioned, there's other episodes in this mini-series we've done in collaboration with Telstra Health and Smart Digital Health around this topic of connected care. But, gents, we're going to have to leave it there. Marvin, Duncan, Keith, appreciate your time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Talking Health Tech. Make sure you like and subscribe, and share this episode with someone who might find it valuable. For more information and resources about healthcare innovation, visit talkinghealthtech.com.